So this is going to be the podcast for the independent and dependent variables. Now, let me tell you what just happened. I just sat and recorded the podcast, and it was about 15 minutes long, and then whenever I went to save it, there was like crazy amounts of noise, and you couldn't even hear me at all. So what I have already done is, let me show you just a quick glimpse. I've already worked through the notes, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to show you a little bit of it at a time. So that I don't have to rewrite all of this. So what you're going to need to do is probably you're going to have to pause and play a lot, all right? Because I'm not going to take the time to rewrite everything. So if I start on the next thing before you finish writing, hit pause, write what you were going to write, and then hit play again. So like I said, you may have to do that several times. Okay. So independent and dependent variable notes is what we're looking at. Okay. Now I did draw a little graph up here that we need to talk about, okay? So if you think about like the coordinate plane, you've got your X and Y axis, okay? Now on the actual notes page, I just drew a little, like the first quadrant. So independent and dependent is where independent is your X variable and dependent is your Y variable, okay? Now, if you think about what the word dependent means, is like every single day, we're dependent on food, okay? We have to have food to live, so we are dependent on food. Same thing with water. We're dependent on water. We're dependent on oxygen. If we don't have oxygen, then we can't breathe, so we can't live. Now, my document camera is going crazy. Let me try changing the light. Oh my goodness. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. Okay, so like we are dependent on oxygen, on food, on water, all of these things we have to be able to live, right? Now, if you think about like your parents, okay? Your parents are independent people, okay? They work, they have a job, they can pay for their own bills, all right? So our parents are independent. We, as y'all, as students, depend on your parents, okay? So you are dependent because if you didn't have your parents, then you wouldn't have any money for food, you wouldn't have any money for clothes, you wouldn't have a ride to school, all of that stuff. So you depend on your parents, right? So really this arrow should be going the other way. You depend on your parents, okay? Now if you think about me and my parents, I am independent of my parents. I do not depend on my parents because I have my own job, I pay my own bills, I have my own car. So I do not depend on my parents, but you as students do, okay? So that just kind of gives you a little information about what independent and dependent means, okay? Now, on the notes page, what it tells us to do is to use complete sentences, okay? Remember that starts with a capital letter and it ends with a punctuation, generally a period, okay? That's what I used on all of the notes. So use complete sentences to describe the dependent and independent variables, okay? So if we look at this first example, it tells us that the quality of the music performance is related to the amount of practice. Okay, so those of you that are in bands know that the more you practice playing your instrument, the better you're going to be at playing, right? If you're not in bands, if let's say you play a sport, football, volleyball, basketball, softball, baseball, something like that, the more that you practice, the better you become, right? Especially as a team, if it's a team sport, you have to practice together to play well together. So the more you practice, the better the performance. So that's just, I kind of just jotted that down. More practice means better performance, okay? So whenever you're working through these problems, if you can think in terms of that, like which one affects the other one, okay? So if I don't practice, I'm not going to be very good, okay? So just write like a real simple statement like that. You'll see as we go through the notes, my statements got more and more simple as we went, okay? So now what I'm going to do, we're going to write a sentence that tells what the independent variable is. So in this case, our practice determines the performance. So our practice is independent and our performance is dependent. So you'll notice that I wrote a sentence. Complete sentence starts with a capital letter, ends with a period. It says the amount of practice time is independent. Okay, that's what I'm looking for as far as a complete sentence goes. So on each of these problems, I wrote a little statement similar to this, and then I have 3 complete sentences underneath it that describes what's independent, what's dependent, and then what I'm going to call a dependency statement. Okay, so the amount of practice time is independent. The quality of the performance is dependent. Okay, so there are 2 of those sentences that we need. So the practice time is independent, the quality is dependent. And then what I'm calling the dependency statement is where I'm just kind of putting it all together. So the quality depends on the practice time, okay? So if I'm very good at something, chances are that means that I practiced a lot to be able to be very good at it, okay? So the quality depends on the amount of practice time. So if this were a homework question, this is what I would want to see on there. So what I want you to do is do the exact same thing on the notes that I'm asking you to do on the homework. That way when you get to the homework, you can look back at your notes and see how it needs to be formatted. Okay, now question number 2 talks about the amount of perfume or cologne applied is related to the severity of an allergic reaction. Let me zoom in a little bit. Okay, now let's say I bought a new perfume and I did not know that I was allergic to something that was in the perfume. Okay, if all I do is spray a little bit on my wrist, then chances are if I'm allergic to it, I'll just have a little rash breakout on my wrist, okay? But if I spray it on my neck, if I spray it on my arms, you know, if I spray it everywhere, then I'm going to have a really severe allergic reaction to it. Now, let me kind of give you some exceptions here. If you're allergic to peanuts, if you're allergic to milk products or gluten or something like that, then it doesn't take much for you to have a really bad allergic reaction. So I'm just specifically talking about perfume and not anything crazy like a food allergy, okay, because that's totally different. So basically, the more perfume I apply, the worse my reaction is going to be. Okay, so you can see this was the statement I wrote on question 1. The statement I wrote on question 2 was a little bit less detailed, but it was still enough that I knew what I was talking about. Okay, so more perfume means that I'm going to have a worse reaction. Okay, so in this problem, the independent variable is the amount of perfume. Okay, and then the more perfume I apply, the worse the reaction is going to be. So my reaction depends on the perfume. So the dependent variable is the severity of the reaction. And then my dependency statement says that the severity of the reaction depends on the amount of perfume that I apply. Okay, so make sure you have these 3 things written down. Again, you may have to hit pause long enough for you to write those things down and then hit play whenever you're done. All right, number 3, the effects of hyperactivity are related to the amount of caffeine consumed. Okay, so generally caffeine makes people hyper. So the more caffeine that you consume, the more hyper you're going to be. So more caffeine means more hyperactivity. So this right here, the amount of caffeine is going to be my independent variable. So that's exactly what I wrote there. And then the amount of hyperactivity is going to be my dependent variable. So my hyperactivity depends on the amount of caffeine. So what you need to do, so like I said, we're writing these 3 sentences here, okay? If this 3rd sentence doesn't match what you wrote here, you need to go back and look at it and see if it's this sentence that's wrong or if it's these 2 sentences that are wrong, okay? All of these things should go right hand in hand. They should all be saying the same thing, okay? All right, number 4. The amount of study time is related to the test grade. So the way that this works is really similar to that music problem back on number 1. So you can think of your study time as your practice time, especially in math. When we're working problems, we're practicing problems, and the more we practice, the better we get at them. We can pick up on the little mistakes that we're making. So that determines how well we're going to do on the test. Okay, so the test grade would be like your performance. The study time is your practice time. Okay, so more studying generally leads to a higher grade. So the amount of study time is our independent variable. The test grade is our dependent variable, and then of course our test grade depends on the amount of study time. Okay, if you think about vocabulary, if you don't ever study your vocabulary and I give you a vocabulary quiz, you're not going to do very well on the quiz. All right, but the more you study those words, the better you get at it, the better your grade would be. All right, number 5, the amount of liquid picked up relates to the absorbency of different paper towel brands. Okay, so let's talk about a scenario here. Okay, I drink sweet tea. So if I spill my sweet tea and I grab this piece of paper here that I'm using for notes, if I grab that piece of paper to try to wipe up that sweet tea that I've spilled, it's not going to do a very good job, right? Paper is not very absorbent, so it's going to pick up a little bit, but I'm not going to be able to pick up a whole lot, okay? Now, if I go grab like a beach towel, beach towels are very absorbent. They will grab a lot of that sweet tea, and it's going to do a really good job of picking it up. Okay, now I know those aren't paper towels, which is what we're talking about in the problem, but hopefully that will help us relate to the problem. So, like if you come to my house, all you're going to see is Bounty paper towels. That's the brand that I prefer because I feel like they're very absorbent. So the brand is what determines how much liquid is picked up. Okay, so just like, the paper, this notes page doesn't pick up very much liquid. So because it's paper, it doesn't pick very much up. So the brand determines the amount picked up. So again, you can see that my little quick statement is getting even shorter. Okay, the brand determines the amount picked up is what that means. So the brand is going to be my independent variable. The amount of liquid picked up is dependent. And then the amount picked up depends on the brand. Okay? So like I said, when I go to the store, I purchase the brand that I think is going to pick up the most. So if I spilled my sweet tea, then I feel like Bounty will pick it up better than any other brand. So the brand determines how much is picked up. Okay? And then number 6, the rate of plant growth is related to the color of light to which it is exposed. Okay? So if you think about a plant, if I had a plant in my classroom, does the fact that the plant is growing determine what the color of the light in my room is? No, it doesn't, okay? But if I change the color of light or even the amount of light, that determines how much the plant is going to grow, okay? So the light affects the growth. Again, my statement's gotten even shorter, okay? Let me see here. Scoot it up some. So the color of light is independent. My plant doesn't affect my light, but my light affects my plant. So the plant growth is dependent, and the plant growth depends on the color of light. Okay, so those are my 3 statements. Again, make sure on all of these you start with a capital letter, you end with a period, so that they're a complete sentence, because if it's not complete sentences, then I will count off on the homework. Okay, now if you look at number 7, it says write one more cause and effect relationship. Identify the independent and dependent quantities or attributes. So basically what I'm asking you to do is you're going to write your own problem. Something like number 5 or number 6, okay? You're writing your own problem. And then once you've got that problem written, you're going to go back and you're going to determine what the independent variable is, what the dependent variable is, and go ahead and write your dependency statement also. Okay, so you're going to have basically a sentence that is your problem, and then you're going to have 3 sentences describing what's independent, what's dependent, and then your dependency statement, okay? You may not have enough room at the end of the page, so if you run out of room here, you can flip to the back and do it. I do want you to have this done when you come to class tomorrow. That way we can kind of look at the different sentences that y'all have written, and we can talk about them and make sure that everybody's on the right track with that, okay? So write a sentence that just something similar to number 5 or number 6, something like that, and then determine independent, dependent, and then a dependency statement. Once you've done that, you need to pick up the homework, which looks like this. It is 5 problems. Let me zoom out a little bit. Okay, the directions are up here. Using complete sentences, determine what the independent and dependent variables are and write a dependency statement. You should have a total of 3 sentences for each problem. Okay, this has 5 problems on it, which means you should have a total of 15 sentences. Okay, now keep in mind that we also wrote like a little statement to help us determine which was independent and dependent. So if you do that, then it's going to look kind of like 4 sentences, but of course this first one was not a complete sentence. Okay.